Hi, I'm Mike Day. Welcome to Third Party Therapy. We work with a variety of suppliers, some big, some small, and often it's the small ones that pose us more of a challenge within TPRM. How do we engage with them? How do we assess them? How do we cope if they don't have all the controls? My guest today is Ellis. Ian's been doing a lot of work with emerging tech companies over the years. He's here to share their viewpoint, along with some thoughts on how we can engage better with startups and be more appreciative of how our processes and our approach impacts these companies. I hope you enjoy it. Ian, thank you for taking the time to join Third Party Therapy Podcast.
It's exciting to be here.
So you and I worked together a number of years ago, actually at a large investment bank, but that's not why we've got you on here today. You've been doing a lot of work with sort of tech startups, small companies, and how they interact with large corporates. Could you just give us an idea about how you got into that, and what your role is and what you're doing with them at the moment?
So I do a lot of things, a lot around emerging technology, as you alluded to. I got into it really when we were working together originally. I ran a lot of innovation processes for the bank we'd worked at. I did that in a couple of other places. I've worked for other organizations like Microsoft for Startups as well, working in their accelerator side, and also in emerging tech groups across insurance, financial services, and also freelance now. So I do a lot of stuff related to emerging companies. I'm also an angel investor, so I see it from the side of the companies quite often too.
The reason I wanted to get you on here, and I'm really keen to get your insight on this, is from a startup perspective. We in the TPRM space, we work usually for large corporates. We work for companies who are often regulated, and we have a whole swathe of controls and processes and assessments and questionnaires and spreadsheets and things like that. And quite often that doesn't land well with small companies, with startups, with tech startups. And often we get challenged with, oh, do we really need to do it? It's only a small company. And quite often we might find the small company really struggling to either complete it or potentially even just completing everything and saying yes to everything, which is just as much a concern. I'm really keen to understand the perspective from the small company, from the startup perspective. So can you just give us an idea of what some of the people you work with and their experiences and challenges with working with corporates, especially in that sort of TPRM onboarding area?
Cool. So the thing to think about when you're thinking about emerging companies is that every company has what we call a burn rate. So that's the amount of runway they have left before they run out of money. And that's kind of important. So what happens is people invest in these companies. They then go spend the money while they're scaling until they become profitable and then, make revenue and then become profitable. So depending on the stage of the company you're engaging with, it's likely that they have a limited shot clock in terms of deals. What that means is that the impact of what seems small on a large organization side, say, minor delays in adoption or minor delays in signing a contract, may have a big impact on the company, even if it's a really good company. So it's not that this is all about bad companies. It's what is, like, if you think about, let's take a scenario. So you're an emerging company and you're dealing with a large bank, and you get bogged down into the contracting and bogged down into the risk processes. And then you miss the quarter. You'd put it in your forecast for that quarter that you get the deal done, and you've just got bogged down in process and pushes over into the first week of the next quarter or second week. That founder and CEO has to go back to their board, and she'll have to say, look, things got bogged down. We're signing now, but it also has an impact then, because when you're looking at a company as an investor, you're looking at their ability to hit numbers on a regular basis, their ability to execute on their vision. And the thing is, if you're a large organization, and especially in enterprise tech of all places, because you probably have a small number of large deals, certainly in the historic way we would have thought about enterprise tech and contracts and stuff, which means that missing a deal has an outsized impact on their forecast, on their quarter or their year. And when you're looking at funding cycles, you're looking at that company going for funding every 2 to 3 years, probably. And what you're looking for in there is the famous VC adage, is what they call a triple, double, double. So you're looking at quarters, you're wanting quarters or years, and you want to see growth in terms of companies tripling tripling again, and then doubling and doubling. So that's what you're really looking for in high performers. It's kind of when you look properly at companies, it's a bit of a lazy adage, but it's a rule of thumb. And so if you miss quarters or miss years, it actually has a knock-on impact. And good companies can miss quarters and years due to protracted processes. And so that's why it's not all about, say, bad companies running into trouble. It's also about good companies having impacts on their valuations or their funding rounds and their funding cycles or their cash flow. So it's all those types of things that it's a lot of things to think about beyond the sort of, when you look behind the Wizard of Oz curtain into emerging companies, is what's actually going on under the covers is sometimes a bit more nuanced.
Yeah. Do you find that the size of a contract with a big bank, a big organization, could that also make these startups overstretch, overpromise? Is that something that they disproportionately chase because of the potential returns on it?
It can be. So there's equal measures of excitement and fear/loathing about really large deals. Um, your investors may say to you, don't chase the big enterprise deals early because they take so long that it could kill the company. If you're chasing 4 or 5 deals and they're all lagging, the company could expire through lack of cash flow. And it's all again, people won't refund, they won't fund the company again if it hasn't hit the adequate milestones to get the next round of funding. So it's how you get those smaller deals often. For the big deals, it's like thinking about, how do you make, as a large organization, how do you think about those deals and emerging companies? I think, and we'll probably get onto a bit of the detail here, but it's like your mindset around that has to be super important.
So how much involvement do investors have? Because we will probably interact with the people who actually work for the startup company, the tech company themselves, but clearly the investors sitting behind it have got a huge amount of influence on this. How much the sort of dependence is there on the investor? How much involvement and is the investor there? Is it literally just going back and reporting every quarter, or in the event of a big deal coming up, would the investors be much more involved in shaping that deal and supporting that deal?
It's big deals will certainly appear in board information, board packs. So depending on the investor, depending on the stage of the company, and depending on the CEO, if the CEO is an experienced CEO and they've been around the block before and done this before, they'll have a different relationship with their investors than if they're a first-time CEO. And then also, like if these deals are impactful to the business itself, which large enterprise deals probably are, they'll be in that stuff will all come up at the board level. So which it leaves an interesting, thought here as well for us, is that if you're working in a large organization and you're sitting in a TPRM function, the actions you have will have impact on the company. And the other thing to think about is like there's a whole reputational piece here as well. So how you manage the reputational piece and think about the fact that something like in the spirit of therapy, I've seen all sorts of things, people breaking up with companies by text, essentially, sending an email to a very important client of a bank telling them, oh, sorry, we're not going to use your product, without even picking up the phone, things like that. All those little things have big impacts. So you've got to remember that, especially if you're working in an industry where the emerging company may become your customer or client at some point, that CEOs have long memories. And if you give them a break early on, that's often how you build credit and relationship with them in the longer term. And so it's how you think about taking the process and making it manageable and human, if that makes sense. The process is important. It's there for a reason, but how do you make the execution of the process something that's a little more human and a little more manageable for an emerging company, if that makes sense?
Absolutely. And I think that is the key. So at the end of the day, there are certain controls that we have to demonstrate are met. It's how we go about doing that. And the standard approach from a corporate would be, here's our due diligence questionnaire, 2, 3, 400 questions, probably knowing the way that the number of companies work, send it across, fill it in, and then we're going to judge you on your responses. How does how does that land within a startup? How does that land within a small company when they receive something like that? I mean, is that something that is sort of frightening because they don't think that they can actually adhere to it? Is it seen as a laborious, needless task? How does, when we apply those large corporate controls and questions to a small company, how does it land?
I'll give you an interesting analogy from my personal experience. So I'm an independent contractor. I did a contract recently with a large organization where I had to change my insurance ratios, which was quite a big undertaking and actually cost me more money, which then I obviously passed on to them. But the interesting thing is it involves you making phone calls to your insurer, involves you, there's a lot of things you have to do. And, when you think about how I would always think, and historically looking at all of these situations, there's two questions I would always ask around companies, emerging companies especially, is are they strategic to what you're doing, and how close to the core of your business are they? The further they are from the core of your business, the less risk is likely to be impacting to your overall existence of your business. So like if you've got an emerging company and it's operating in your, nobody takes on emerging companies to be their ERP, for a good reason. So if you've got an emerging company, it's operating near your core, it's probably a higher risk than a company operating on the edge of your business. And then level of strategic importance then becomes important as well, because how important is that business to you in terms of executing what your strategy is?
Obviously, from a TPRM perspective, we look at things through a multitude of lenses, whether it be access to data, the resilience angle, which is what you're saying in terms of the core processes. It could be through sort of interaction with the customer. I think one of the perceptions that I've got and what I've seen in the past is often when companies come in with a small engagement, maybe even a pilot, and they come into the organization. And then once they're in, it sort of propagates. It gets used. If it's a really useful tool, it starts being deployed on multiple desktops or in multiple servers or however it operates. And before you know it, it's gone from sort of 3 users and a really good relationship with a small company to being hundreds or thousands of users, and it's just not scalable. And this is where we sort of turn the tide in terms of not just the risks to the startup, because there's obviously a lot of risks there in terms of their ability to support and not overstretch themselves. But from the corporate's perspective, you start to increase your reliance, you increase your usage of a product that doesn't have the backup and the infrastructure behind it to actually support it. So quite often, I think if they're taking a big contract, that's almost like a quantifiable risk. It's that almost gradual increase, isn't it, that almost poses an even bigger concern.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that is, as you're looking at that, there's a number of factors you should think about. When you think about it on the technical side, suddenly you're probably quite inefficient in terms of how you're running the back end, because you probably have it deployed in lots of places individually. And in the old days, that would have meant lots of servers, whereas then building a center of excellence, so it's deployed better in terms of infrastructure, deployed better in terms of security, deployed better in terms of how it's actually adopted by people and helping them to like, it's actually a good problem to have, where a company suddenly becomes very ubiquitous across your organization very quickly, because it means people are loving the product, which is a good thing, but then it's how you deal with the risk on the other side. And so thinking about that, I would argue there's an element of, if the company is mature in how they think about adoption with large organizations, they should have some of these questions answered. Like, I'll give you an example. I was talking with a company a couple of years ago, and they were, going in to meet JP Morgan, and JP Morgan had them in an RFP for a huge deal. And the company was probably around, 10 or 15 people. And I said to the CEO, now, I assume you've taken into consideration that, if you do this large or whatever 7-figure deal with JP Morgan, that, they're going to be phoning you whenever they want. And because they want a throat to choke, something breaks, they want to phone you, the organization, they want someone at the end of the phone. And typically, in what we would call the sort of quote unquote hustle culture of an emerging company or a startup, especially at the early stage, the founder is doing everything. But when you get to those sort of big deals, or when you get to the sort of sudden mass adoption by accident, let's call it, or by virility of the product, then suddenly you're in a situation where it can't be the founder or the CEO picking up the phone all the time. And have they factored that into their pricing? So if the price looks too cheap to be true, it probably is, if that makes sense. because they may not have factored in those types of things. And that's a maturity question, and whether the founders have been around the block before of dealing with large enterprises, all those types of questions. They understand what's happening in your side. Those are the type of things to watch out for. So understand, does it look too good? Is it too cheap? Is that really the price? Surely it can't be that cheap. Probably it shouldn't be, and people are notoriously bad at underpricing their products at an early stage. And so that's something to think about as well. And you probably, if the product has like the viral uptake you're talking about, you'd probably be happy to pay more for it to make sure that it's stable. You've got that risk versus cost play there. So there's all those types of things to think about as well. And, and then it's just, what are the right processes to understand the viability of the company, understand all the questions, all the core questions you're asking need to be asked at a bigger scale. The use case hasn't changed, just the scope has changed significantly. And so if you're looking at a company in terms of viability, say financial viability, you want to make sure that the investors have deep pockets so that they, because this is a good situation where you're probably going to be paying them a lot more money over time, but then, they also have to scale. And there's that chicken and egg of hiring the people that they need to hire now to support the scaling that you're bringing down the pipe for them.
Absolutely. So that's an interesting question. So in terms of, one of the many checks that we would do from a TPRM perspective would be to look at the financial position of a company that we're proposing to use. And quite often, startups, if they're VC backed, it's not the sort of thing that you can easily just run and Dun & Bradstreet report on and, off you go, you've got a nice rating. How can we delve into these financials? How do you get comfort with a startup that is VC backed, that they have got that backing and they have, clearly the VC is going to be relatively cash rich, in terms of their ability to invest, but that's very different from their intent being there to support the startup rather than just, they're not making money, let's pull the money out and run. How have you seen that addressed, and how do you think people could go ahead and do that?
So if we take a step back for a second and look at how VCs work, there's two things about a VC funding model that are important to understand. One is that it's a fund cycle. So normally fund cycles are anything from, 5 to 7. Well, if you're lucky, you completely exit a fund in 7 years, but they can run on. I've seen funds run on to 12 or 15 years. And so, but there's an investment cycle within that fund when they'll deploy all the capital, and then they'll just be holding money for follow-on deployment. So they'll deploy into the initial deals. And then those deals, then when they come around, they want to deploy follow-on funds. They want to double down on companies that are doing well. So they'll deploy more money into those in the follow-on rounds, and they'll have the ability to do that via preemptions and stuff. And they'll also have the ability to understand, how the companies are doing. So there's that aspect. And then there's also the aspect that if you look at, say, 10 companies in a VC portfolio, let's say there's 10 in the portfolio, the chances of them hitting what they would call the power law outsized return, so really hitting a home run, it's not big, it's slim. So you're looking at, if you've got 10 companies, you probably expect 3 to fail, probably 4 to 5 of them will do okay, and they'll make some of the money back, or all of their initial investment back. And then you're looking at, if you do 2 that do really, really, really well, like hit the ball out of the park, that's a big win for that fund. Because what they're trying to do is they're trying to get the capital back initially that they've put in. And then from there, they're then looking at everything else as then the return beyond capital. And they probably have hurdle rates from their LP investors and stuff that says you have to hit certain milestones in terms of getting money back before you can take, what's called carry, which is essentially profit share take profit share out. So it's important to understand what you're dealing with there, in terms of the companies, because the company will be in a fund. If that company's performing well, there'll be no problem with giving them more money. If they're not performing as well, then the question is, will they get more money from that investor? The other thing is, you also have to, when you look at investors, some of them have certain rules within that they have to adhere to as part of their fund. Whether it's the strategy or what they've agreed with their LP investors, so they're investors who've invested in them. And so some funds won't do follow-on. So understanding if the investor that's invested in the company you're looking at does follow-on investments, if they're willing to back the founders and sort of drop money. And this was a classic thing when we had the sort of, let's call it the VC downturn, sort of after 21, sort of coming into 22, 23. A lot of people doubled down on the companies they'd invested in and weren't making new investments. They were just recommitting money into the companies they'd already backed to keep them going through the sort of quieter time when it was harder to get funding. So those are the types of things to think about, understanding a bit more about where the company is going, understanding a bit more about the risk of them not getting further investment, understanding what they're, as I said earlier on, really the key things here are their burn rate, how fast are they going through money, and how much money have they left, which is, pretty obvious. And as you said there a second ago, like, you can't just get a Dun and Bradstreet report for this because there's so many nuances within this that it makes it a little more complicated. Some of the more advanced folks in this space, like in some of the large investment banks, will have teams that actually will sign a special NDA with the companies and then go through their financials in detail and understand all the core metrics like a VC firm would to understand where the company's going. And then also if the company needs money, they'll often go and help them get funding. If they really are intent to use the product, they'll help them go and get funding, to make sure that the company's stable on a financial footing.
And it's probably not the answer that a lot of folks need to hear, but if you don't have that special skill set and special capability in-house, then you're really going to struggle to be able to. I mean, effectively, you could reach out to the investors, you could actually have a conversation with them, but it's quite a technical analysis that you need to do to understand how they're going to support that company. Because effectively, what we're looking for is, if we bring this company on board, if they go through a challenging period, do their backers stand by them to be able to fund them to continue to provide the service to us? I mean, ultimately, we're being relatively selfish about it. That's what we care about. And whilst there may be that follow-on investment, as you said earlier, it is primarily based on a company that is doing well, not necessarily a company that is struggling and needs supporting, although one assumes they're taking a slightly longer term view than just that particular point in time in doing that. One of the things that strikes me at the moment is actually the role of the startup, the role of these smaller companies actually increasing. I mean, you talked about sort of the tech world, and that's sort of driving this in terms of AI capabilities, AI solutions. The ability to launch a solution based on a cloud platform. So you can, use an AWS or an Azure or a Google platform, which in many ways, from our perspective, brings a level of resilience, because you're not worried about the hosting strategy of a startup. I mean, you might be worried about where they're putting the data and how they're configuring AWS or whatever, but the underlying infrastructure is more stable. Are you seeing that trend in terms of tech startups selling more into corporates over the last few years? I appreciate COVID probably put a bit of a wobble in the middle of all that, but is that what you see as well?
Yeah, I think this, as you mentioned, AI is having a big role. It's never been easier to start a company. And I don't think this is probably going to be a little controversial. It's never been harder to scale a company. Because the problem you have looking at this from the corporate side into the emerging tech ecosystem is that the noise to signal ratio has deteriorated considerably because you've more people in the space trying to do things. There's more people claiming they can do things. There's a lot of stuff you have to weed through now. And I would argue if you see an emerging company that's very early, like a super early startup doing something, I bet you there'll be someone more mature doing it as well. So the question you have to work out is what's the right point you want to enter the innovation versus risk management play. If you're looking at something so early that you're very worried about its viability, you've got to ask, is it so early because it's in such an advanced position in the market, or is it so early because you haven't done your market search sufficiently to see that, there's a slightly larger or more substantial or more stable emerging company doing it, or maybe IBM's doing it, so that you got to ask those questions sometimes. And this is meant to be a shot at innovation teams, but often innovation teams aren't structured pragmatically for that, Because what will happen is, and you've probably seen this, you've been around the block, you've probably seen an innovation team goes and finds a super exciting technology doing something super cool and it's really exciting. They bring it in and then it gets skewered in procurement because IBM also do that. Or, or NetApp do it, or whoever, like Oracle do it, choose your behemoth of choice. And that's because the innovation teams always look at the emerging end of the ecosystem, never look at the mature end of the ecosystem. So they never look at the large incumbents. They always look at the emerging companies. And because they don't have that end-to-end view, they don't have a holistic picture. And so that's why I'd argue that's often why you see failures in adoption of emerging companies, because you need the end-to-end rationale to put the strong case forward as to why you should use this emerging company over a large incumbent.
So we touched there about failures that you've seen coming in. How have you seen successful collaborations occur between large corporates, startups, where both sides managed to de-risk it, both sides managed to develop a relationship that works for both parties? Can you give us a view of what have you seen that works well?
So there's a phrase in startup land and it's basically vitamin pills versus painkillers. So is your solution a painkiller? Does it solve an actual acute problem? Or is it a vitamin pill? Is it a nice to have? So thinking about, things that are critically important, the fastest road to adoption I've ever seen was 3 months from first meeting to contract. And people are like normally talking, oh my God, it takes years for these things to get done. When there's a need, where there's a will, there's a way. When there's a need, there's a way. And if there's something that you need to get done inside the organization and an emerging company can solve it for you and it's the best way to do it, it will get done. And so I think there's an element of, throughout all the theater of innovation and all this stuff, if there's a need, things will get done. And so making sure that the best practices from a corporate side, I think, is thinking about making sure that you're not indulging in science projects. So you're not going away to, and actually procurement and TPRM and governance play an important role here. Because for you guys, you need to get involved early in the process to understand what's actually going on. Understand that the diligence has been done properly on the technical side and various other aspects, and also to understand it helps the company to know that this isn't a one person who's tinkering with something, in their spare time and it's not relevant to the organization. Procurement, TPRM, and risk being involved early shows impetus by the organization to get something done. Yeah. So getting involved early in those conversations is valuable. It also helps you to see what's coming down the tracks and get ahead of it. Because sometimes there'll be no choice and it has to get done. Also knowing what battles to fight and understanding the real risk. So I'll give you an example with Log4j like a couple of years ago. I was saying recently, but that was a little while ago. There's the famous story of like Log4j comes out and a risk person goes, turn everything off, because Log4j is in everything. But the thing about it is it impacts different applications in different ways. So actually understanding the impact and the real risk is very important. There's a great story. A friend of mine who's in cybersecurity says, he said, they were adopting a product and the product had some functionality in it, and the security risk people were like, oh, you can't deploy that, it's high risk. And it, what's it need that for? And it wasn't like, why does it need to do this, what it's doing? And actually it was just using, it was a randomizer, I think, and it was basically being used to choose the colors in a pie chart. And so it wasn't anything that was going to negatively impact the organization in any material way if it went bad, and it had no way to break out from that. So thinking about what the risk really is important as well. And how real the impact would be, how, as we said earlier, how close is it to the center, how strategic is it to your organization, and thinking about all that stuff. We talked a bit about a minute ago about the role of startups changing. I think the other thing to bear in mind is the consumption models are changing. And so you've got, like, obviously it's never easier to start a company. Now you've got consumption models changing with cloud, the concept of MAC credits now. So the large cloud providers are allowing organizations to buy through their marketplaces. So they may have done some diligence on those companies.
Yeah.
It's important to check, have they? Because they may not have equally. So knowing from some of the things I've seen inside large cloud providers, so understanding, using MAC credits. The thing with MAC credits is everybody, their eyes were pretty much bigger than their tummy when they signed large cloud deals. Now they've money swashing around that's essentially free because it's going to go away. And so being able to use that is a great enabler for an organization, but it also brings a different consumption method, and it brings the marketplace models and all that type of stuff that probably are new to thinking about in terms of risk. So how do you think about all that stuff? So
absolutely, and I've seen definitely that situation where the Amazon Works marketplace or the Microsoft equivalent, it's automatically deployed within cloud environments and effectively acts as a backdoor way of tech being purchased and implemented, which completely bypasses procurement. It completely bypasses TPRM, and it's something that people need to be aware of and go and look at and make sure that either the right controls are in place or, dare I say it's shut down, because it can pose real risk.
Yeah.
I quite like the point you were making earlier that bringing procurement and TPRM and risk into a conversation early actually shows commitment, shows that something's serious, and there is therefore obviously a benefit to the startup for seeing those people being engaged. I think it's quite nice to find a message which says that early engagement and getting procurement and TPRM engaged at an early stage is seen as a positive benefit to the supplier. That's not often the messaging that we get, but it's going back to the topic there. One of the things that often gets thrown around is the proof of concept. So, we don't know if we want to use it. We want to sign a proof of concept, and ideally, one assumes do it in some sort of, utilize a tool in some sort of ring fenced, minimal risk way. Are there risks involved with the proof of concept from a startup perspective? Are they good? Are they bad? Is it just a case of approach with caution? What's the view on proofs of concept?
So from an emerging company, if I was looking into a proof of concept, the questions I'd be asking is, do I charge for it or not? Mm. So understanding whether you can put money where your mouth is in terms of wanting to test the technology. This one I'm on the fence on, because there's two schools of thought here. One is that, you're a large organization, you should be able to pony up some money to do a proof of concept. But then on the flip side, how many proof of concepts do you do a year in a large organization? And, I don't care about the money. What I care about is the intent. So if you're putting the right people in place, if you're expediting and doing it quickly, I'd rather it got done and you got to the actual contract than, it being money and then it being a science project that just had a bit of money behind it. So thinking about that sort of, that sort of stuff is important. I think when you get into the legal stuff, redlining can be the kiss of death for projects. And when I talk with emerging companies, it's like, if it's not egregious, just sign the NDA, just sign the POC agreement. And there's some technologies and platforms that are actively out there now helping people to streamline all those processes. So thinking about all that stuff as well. I think, the POC thing, it goes back to intent again, like we said a minute ago. And it's like, if I'm looking at a POC and I'm sitting advising a founder and they're saying, oh, there's a POC going on, it's this guy in sector 7G and he's like, he does this and he does that, but, does it have the ear of the people who are going to actually sign the deal? So, and this is the other thing when I'm talking with emerging companies, it's like, who do you approach? Is there a value in approaching the CIO? Sure, the CIO is great. Maybe it's great to talk with her and understand what's going on. She's probably not doing the engineering decision making. She's probably signing the deal at the top, and she trusts her people to do what's needed in terms of the diligence and all the work. So is there used to be this problem we had in a bank I worked in, not the one we worked in, a different one, where the innovation team, the COO or the CIO would go out to the West Coast and on their own, and the innovation team would prop a load of companies in front of them. And the two things happened that were bad. One was they would invariably put companies in front of them that had already been declined by the organization, which means you do this great circle of everything rolling down a hill and it going back into the organization, rolling around, and everyone going, well, we've looked at
Yeah.
this already, and going back up and saying no. Because senior management are a bit like royalty. They never say no. They just deflect. And so what happens is it's like, oh, lovely to meet that company. Yeah, such and such will look at this, rather than it being they never want to say no. And so that's your first problem. And then the second is that, they meet a load of companies, and they're never going to do the engineering looking at it in detail. So they're too senior, and then all the emerging companies, oh my God, I met the CIO, it's really exciting, she's great, and then nothing happens. And so you have a reputational risk again, because it falls down a hill and then someone doesn't bother lower down, or someone gets kicked lower down in the organization and sort of does it grudgingly. So there's all those types of problems you have about where you engage. So there's a group in VC fund in New York called Workbench. An old mutual friend of ours, John Lair, works there, and they have this philosophy called what they call the middle out philosophy, which is you want someone senior enough that they can make a decision, but junior enough that they have time to make a decision.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so as you're deploying individuals to work on stuff, that's how I would think about it in corporates, and that's how emerging companies often try and think about it, is getting to the right person to make the decision quickly. The other thing about this is, back to the reputational stuff, saying no fast is not a bad thing. Don't be afraid of hurting a CEO's feelings. If it's something that their time is more important than their feelings, and if it's something that's not going to fly inside your organization because of technically or risk profile or whatever, say no quickly. And that's where having the risk functions involved early can help, because if it's something that the technical person is getting way overexcited, but suddenly it's like, well, actually, that's never good. You never want to go 6 months down the line of technical conversations to be put in front of a risk function and then go, well, we'd never use that for these reasons.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a maturity thing
we...
inside an organization, and it's a maturity thing of the founders should be looking at these conversations going, if I'm not talking to people who are going to sign checks and people who are going to, if I'm not doing the objection handling on the people who are going to say no in risk or in like procurement early, then I should be thinking quicker about that.
Absolutely. And I guess if that meeting with the CIO has happened and there's that level of excitement, that could actually feed back into sort of pipeline forecasts and things like that, which goes back to the conversation we're having earlier about, missing deadlines on potential deals where, the expectation is sort of high, but the actual reality, if they spoke to the right people, would be, no, we're not going to go ahead with that. So, that honesty level, and I think is really, really key when we're looking at this. And the other piece you mentioned, and you mentioned it earlier, especially the smaller end of the startup group, it may well be the founder doing everything from a development and a support, which means that it's also the founder who is looking at contracts and getting red line contracts. And, the standard approach from corporates is, here's our template contract, sign it, and well, first of all, you probably need a legal background to be able to go through and actually understand what you're signing, and your average founder is not a lawyer. And the attraction of getting that deal can run the risk that they actually sign up to things that they shouldn't do, especially in terms of sort of liabilities, intellectual property, all that sort of stuff going on. Startups need to be very careful, and we need to be very careful as corporates to look at it and go, do we feel that that the supplier is giving away too much? And this is almost where, it goes back into the conversation about how can we work better with startups, is both on the TPRM side and the contract side, there could be levels of guidance we can give to startups. This is what we're looking for, and this is why we're looking for it. And if the case is, okay, you can't do it now, you're too small, you don't have the swathe of cybersecurity controls that we're looking for, or the compliance around anti-bribery and corruption. Not that there's anything bad about the company, to your point earlier, but they just don't have those demonstrable controls.
Yeah,
Being able
they've never
to
hit
provide
the
that
point where
feedback.
they needed them yet. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. So we could give them that advice and go back and say, well, this is what we would look for. And then maybe in 12, 18, 24 months' time, when they've grown, whether that's with us directly or with other large corporates, they're better equipped then to react, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. And it's treating it as not attritional, not combative, but collaborative and it's kind of a bit of a mindset shift, especially for procurement people. But the thing is, like, I remember one of our old colleagues saying, if the deal has been negotiated so hard, they've taken so much money off the table for the company that they can't afford to support the deal, it's not a good deal. And so thinking a bit pragmatically about it, it's probably, if we're in a large organization and it's a company at the edge of your, small deployment of a company at the edge, they've probably underpriced their product. So don't kick them too hard in squeezing them down. And think about, as you're thinking about the risk processes, almost like take them through what you're looking for and help them and guide them a bit. There used to be in security architecture, I remember seeing there was like a group in a place I worked once, which was security integration, which was sat ahead of security architecture and worked with the companies coming in and also with the engineers inside to make sure that when they got to the security architecture group, it was a much easier conversation. Try and solve the problems up front. Don't beat each other up afterwards. Like, let's work through it together and walk through it together. I think that's important.
Is there a role here with sort of, I mean, you mentioned IBM earlier, but those large tech companies to play a role in introducing or partnering with these startups to sort of de-risk relationships as well?
This is a conversation I've been having with a couple of consulting firms. I've seen examples, and you've probably seen them in history, where we all kind of know code escrow is not valuable. It's going to be a little controversial. Like, it's not worth the paper it's written on, really, because the challenge you have is that if you get handed, the company fails, you get handed the code. What are you going to do with it? Without the context of the people who've written the code. Now, this may change in a world of AI where you can reverse engineer code and all that stuff. But without there's a lot of work involved in unscrambling what you're handed. And you'll probably end up bringing in a consulting firm to do it, or someone to help you do it. So why not front end that process? And so my appeal to all the, potential partners and consulting firms, who are listening out there, who want to work with the emerging tech ecosystem, think about how you stand over risk for large corporates, because that could give you a unique position where companies subcontract up into a larger consulting firm who already has, the heads of terms done and your service level like agreements are all done and your master services stuff is in place and your master agreements are all there, and then they subcontract in through. And that, for high potential companies, that could be a very interesting way of going to market if the terms are right and the large incumbents don't try and take too much off the table for the companies in the deal. Like, that's where the impetus of these marketplace plays are for, like, your large cloud providers. The question is, I don't think they've ever gone as far as saying they're going to stand over risk or extensively diligence the companies. That maybe is the next step in terms of differentiating one market. The trouble with marketplaces is they tend to be swamps. And your large cloud provider is going to allow everybody within reason into the marketplace, because why not? So, like, how you work out what's really valuable in there versus what's not so valuable is the challenge. And so I think, there are curation programs within, like Microsoft has the Unicorn and Pegasus programs and stuff, where there are companies that they're a lot closer to who they've proven and done deals with. The other question, like from a corporate side, is, as you're looking at all these risk things, is understanding, are you the first corporate in from your peer group, or are you like middle of the pack? So are you in the, that sort of curve of adoption that, you've the early adopters, you've the middle, and then you've the laggards? Are you in the early, are you in the middle, or are you at the back? And if you're at the back, you're probably pretty safe to go with this technology because everybody else is in it already and they've beaten the crap out of it already in terms of risk. So,
Ian, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, we talked about AI, we talked about cloud, and we've talked about how TPRM organizations can interact with these companies. Are there technology solutions that you're seeing coming through that would actually act as a disruptor within TPRM, that TPRM teams would be interested to look at and explore to try and improve things?
there are certainly a number of solutions that are interesting in the space, both for TPRM teams and procurement/corporate teams to use, but also that are beginning to disrupt. And you have to bear in mind that these solutions exist on the other side of the equation. So if we think about the corporate side first, you've got like companies that are really designed to help both the emerging company and the corporate reduce repetitive processes. So companies with the likes of Risk Ledger, who basically take a more community approach, because obviously you take a point in time decision, but you also want to be watching the evolution of that company in terms of risk. And so with other people doing assessments, they're constantly updating. And rather than updating just company X, corporate X and corporate Y and corporate Z over a time frame, if you're feeding that information back into the communal pool of data about the company, you can then keep a bit of a watching brief on how the risk evolves. So real time risk monitoring, or sort of near, gaining the benefit of other people's assessments as you go along. Then you've got companies like Tech Passport that are working on streamlining POCs. And the big thing about that is it's good on the platform front because it simplifies, it creates a platform. But the smart thing they do is they focus on encouraging corporates to really simplify their terms and conditions and their contracts and stuff, and simplifying the contracting process. And you're seeing several large corporates use that. They're also now, because they're gathering that data, they're now delving into DORA and being able to look at third, fourth, fifth party risk, because they now have the ability to do the cascade. The other thing, if you flip it on the other side, and this might be one to be wary of, is that there's a number of solutions in the market now, because what you're asking a company to do on the opposite side of the TPRM equation is highly repetitive. There's a number of companies in the space that are doing AI-based RFP response, and then also AI-based risk questionnaire response. And the question becomes then about how good, and I don't know the answer to this, how good those responses are and how accurate they become, because it obviously you've got like 300, 400 questions. Inaccuracy can get lost in the mix. So especially if you're beginning to have automation in the space. And it goes so the question is, how much of it is templated versus written purely by AI? What's the risk associated with that? So that's something just to bear in mind on the flip side as well.
It's interesting because one of the previous podcasts we had with Aki Eldar from Murata was talking about the questionnaire killer, and it's the idea that you can pull in standard documentation, SOC 2s, etc., and then map that to your control framework. And effectively, all you're doing is exactly the same thing, but just in a different place, aren't you? In that we're asking our questionnaire, the supplier is applying an AI platform to go answer the questionnaire and send it back and save us some time. But yeah, because it's outside of our control and not necessarily visible to us, it brings a risk with it as
Yeah,
well. So
exactly.
that's really useful.
Whereas you may want to rethink, and I think over time you'll see that whole process being rethought. Because if you think about it, I bet 90% of the questions asked in the questionnaires are similar, if not the same. And
Absolutely.
so how
And
do you think about that,
yeah, and you only have to look at the growth of community due diligence solutions like Helios and Achilles and KY3P, where they are,
Hmm.
or even things like the SIG questionnaire set, which is a standard set of questions that goes out to everybody, and they either answer it once and share the output, or in the case of the SIG questionnaire, you can just recycle that questionnaire multiple times and ingest it. It makes a big difference. Yeah, and we were saying before this interview, I think TPRM with the variety of data feeds, the variety of risks, cyber, data privacy, etc., the variety of regulatory requirements is just crying out for an AI overlay over the top of it that can consume all of this data and do something with it. But of course, we are a risk function, so we will approach that with a huge amount of caution in terms of what it actually does,
Of course.
transparency and what have you. So it's a classic example of where we look at it and go, that'd be great, but it'd be risky. So how can we do it? And I'm sure we will get there at some point. One of the things that we try and do, and we've touched on a couple of things already within on the podcast, is just to understand people's learning experiences where you've seen companies try and engage with startups and it's not gone quite as well as possible. Not through any sort of macabre sort of interest, but more to learn from others' mistakes. Really, where have you seen it not work so well when these two types of companies come together?
So where companies haven't done their market diligence well, And also this can, I'll co-mingle this with the role of accelerators, because accelerators I love to hate and I hate to love. But no, like accelerators, I beat down on them a bit, but they're good. Some are good, some are not. So it's a bit of a mixed market. Like, and the problem you have is if you have I remember British Airways had an accelerator and I was working at Microsoft, and we had this brilliant company that had come from the US that were trying to get in the telemetry space into British Airways. And they were working with other airlines in the US and all this stuff. And there was a small company in the UK that were like two people in a shed with a dog.
Mhm.
And, because they were in the accelerator, everyone was backing them. And it meant that you'd essentially boxed out a large, high potential competitor. And so understanding how you do your market search, not being wedded to often, and especially executives, but sometimes often engineers as well, suffer from what I call shiny object syndrome. And so the concept is, the problem you have is that someone meets a solution and then the solution is fitted to the problem. Understand the problem and look at all the solutions out there and find the best one. Don't pick a solution and reverse it into the problem you have, because there's probably competitors out there. And if there's competitors out there, it's a good thing. It proves there's a market.
Yeah.
Which is good in other ways as well. So if you're looking at a solution and there's no competitors out there, but you think it's a solution across the whole industry, they're either very early or for some reason there isn't a market. So understanding, what that is, and then understanding what the competitors are is interesting as well, because the competitors can sometimes be Excel. It doesn't have to be, so that's a question I would ask. And this is, when you get around to what you're thinking about in terms of your process, how you make the process as brief as possible, but then also, like, I was at an organization and they're like, oh, we've brought our, they had a big, champagne reception because they brought their risk processes down from 365 days to assess the company down to 180. I'm like, that's not, that's not the answer we're looking for. It's like, there must be a better way. And so working out what matters, what doesn't, working out how you get ahead of these things, making things simpler where they can be simpler. And then, understanding how you're looking at the market assessment. I would put a gating question in early in your, when money's being assigned for a project, there should be a gating question around market assessments, I think. I think that's important, because what that does is you should, before you can make a purchasing decision, you should prove that you've looked at the market. And there should be one at the start and one at the end. And you should be able to see the maturity of evolution of the maturity of the assessment through that. Because I think the other problem you have is that when you're looking into the market, the likes of accelerators will say to companies, we will introduce you to customers, whether those companies are ready to be introduced or not, which is not good for the companies, because what happens is if you as a corporate meet a company too early, you then go, that sticks in your head, oh, they didn't have these solutions. And then when they come back around 3 years later and they've solved all the problems that they didn't have solutions for at the time, you're like, oh, well, they were too early when we saw them before. And you sort of forget that everything changes. So there's an art to the right timing of meeting companies and stuff. So I think that's something to think about, getting right. I think how you communicate the process is the process, as we said earlier on, but how you execute the process is in your control. So giving the companies respect. I'm a funny person. I don't often use the word startup, because I use emerging company, because I think of these companies are all businesses that are emerging. And so think of these are all highly ambitious people who want to get something done. There's a bit too much of the cult of the entrepreneur around, where it's like lifestyle, people doing, what do they call them, wannapreneurs, where it's like people who don't really ever do anything but think they're entrepreneurs. Whereas actually the likelihood is if a company's made it as far as talking with a risk person, they're probably a real company. And it's the degree of reality is the question then. And so thinking about that and treating them with respect, remembering that small things you do will have big impacts in the longer term, possibly on your business as well. So, breaking up by text I joked about earlier, but how you communicate, if it's a company that's important to a VC firm, that's important to your business, take the time to pick up the phone. I've seen a lot of people sending emails, and then what happens is you get an angry call from the partner at the VC firm if you're on the client side, and then that all these things create problems. So thinking about how you everybody wants to be treated fairly. So relationships are about fairness. It's not about the individual deal, winning or losing the deal. Everyone's happy to lose a deal, provided they feel that they've had a fair shot. So where you're not giving, where where that it's not going to be viable for the company to help companies, early communication is good. The bad side of late communication and impersonal communication is pretty bad. I've seen that before as well. And then making sure that you've run a process. I've seen CEOs of companies pick up with bankers and stuff where they feel the process hasn't been fair, and then some poor schmuck in Sector 7G of procurement gets slapped because they haven't really done their work properly. So how you think about those type of things is important as well. And we've seen companies go bust as well. And what happens when a company goes bust? How do you manage that process? I was talking with a friend of mine, and she had a company that they wound down in 2016. And she said it was a very emotional time. She had the company with her husband, and they divided duties. She phoned the investors, who are extremely understanding, because don't forget, they expect 7 out of 10 companies to fail, and she was very appropriate and did it with grace and whatever, you know what I mean, it was done well. But she didn't want to phone. Her partner phoned the customers, because that was quite difficult for her. So it's a difficult situation for a company if it's failing. So how you treat them with empathy and work out how you resolve the situation to everyone's best interest when things go wrong is also important as well.
I think those are really important sort of thoughts and very almost basic principles about how we can deal with emerging companies, emerging enterprises as we move forward. And I think that's at a basic level. If people are starting to deal with those sorts of companies, to keep those things in mind, almost regardless of the process, regardless of the controls and checks, they are what they are. And we're always under pressure to make them more efficient. But the way we deploy them, the respect we use, the way of thinking about how they will be received, and the fact that small things from our side will have a big impact on the others is really, really important to take away. Ian, thank you so much for that. Really, really enjoyed that conversation. I think getting that perspective from the smaller companies side is crucial, because I think it's a real litmus test for how our processes work and how our operations work as well. And the fact that it's not one size fits all. We shouldn't assume that we're all dealing with large companies. These are real people out there as well who we need to be mindful of. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about it. I'm sure it'd be really, really, really useful for folks to listen to. And who knows, we might carry this conversation on and get you back on again at some point in the future. Really appreciate it.
Sounds good. Great. It was an adventure.
Thank you for listening to Third Party Therapy. If you like that, why not click on the like button below and subscribe so you get updates in the future, and head over to thirdpartytherapy.com and sign up to our mailing list. Thank you very much.